Africa was a promising land to its European colonizers. Like the Americas, it boasted natural resources and new, hopeful pastures to graze. The kings of Europe set out to claim it, and through their efforts of negotiations, conquest, exploration, subjugation, and administration, the entire continent ended up divided up by European powers within only a few decades. Only a small portion of North Africa remained outside of European control, being occupied instead by the Turks. This was of course going to change with the First World War. This of course changed with the outcome of the First World War with the Treaty of Versailles. We are often detailed horrors and atrocities from this era, its accomplishments completely ignored, replaced by cautionary accounts of massacre and slavery. Do we not see this with the history of the Americas as well? The Spanish seemingly brought only death to the Native Americans according to modern curriculums, coming to America with disease and the sword, nothing more. Yet cultural relativism leads one to forget the savagery of the American natives, both North and South, peoples who engaged in human sacrifice, slavery, and just as much war as everyone else. Let us forfeit these modern interpretations of nation building and civilization. The historical precedent is one of conquest. The Israelites conquered the land of Canaan, massacred the Canaanites as God had commanded, and subjugated those that they didn't put to the sword. The Canaanites were wicked, they were primitive, and such measures were necessary for what was then the center of the ancient world to turn from depravity to holiness. While we can't compare the will of men in their conquests to the will of God in his conquest of Canaan, we can take a lesson from this. With conquest, there has always been atrocity and subjugation from the ancient era to the modern era. Does this view excuse such atrocity and subjugation? Certainly not, but it acknowledges its seeming necessity. Even so, the European colonizers at many times did not subject their newfound territories to a purifying sword like medieval kings and ancient warlords usually would. Was the imperial acquisitions of European powers not also inevitable? Can we imagine a world without the global conquest of Europe's powers? No, certainly not. The colonial spirit was inevitable, just as many wars are. Human society is flawed, so all of our endeavors, when it comes to the state, the realm, the goals of people, the aspirations of men, will inherently be flawed. Does the modern scholar expect the states of the past to have went about their imperial business with absolute perfection, actions taken in the light of not even the objective morality of God, but the subjective and relative morality of our modern secular dystopia? Let us look at colonialism with some nuance then, and realize both its faults and its benefits. When we realize that this process was not completely evil and was inherently inevitable, we can see what good it brought and what wrongs independence has brought for the post-colonial world. With this in mind, let us look at the tragedy of Rhodesia.
R is for the regiments who fight the winning fight. H is for the home fires that the folks are keeping bright. O is for the other ranks and officers as well. And D is for the diehards who believe in fighting hell. E is for the enemy that just won't ever win. S is for the spirit of our men that won't grow dim. I is for the independence that we have to shed. And A is for the arms that we will always have to bear.
Before the Rhodesians arrived, what we presently know as Zimbabwe was conquered. The Shona people had formed a perhaps primitive yet functional state, bringing muskets into their military as the Portuguese saw the plateau as a new target for conquest. It was around in the 1600s. When the Portuguese were colonizing Mozambique. Calling themselves Rousey, which means destroyers, a professional army was established and the Portuguese were successfully repelled. Yet the natives of Zimbabwe were to be soon routed by a new threat, the Zulu general Mzilikazi. This offshoot of the Zulus marched northwards, leaving destruction and terror in their wake. They kept going northward until they met the Rousey. And by 1838, the destroyers had been destroyed. Soon after, the British South African Company expanded into Zimbabwe. This set the stage for the First Matabele War, where both sides were hesitant to engage. Cecil Rhodes didn't want the British to lose confidence in the territory, and a war would certainly do just that. The Matabele Zulus understood that an encounter with the company would be less of a battle and more of a massacre. Yet war was inevitable, and the conflict sparked when the Zulu king Labengula tried to force a Mashona chief to pay him tribute. This Mashona chief, Gomara, was now under the control of the Rhodesians at Fort Victoria, so the company would come to his defense against Lobengula's forceful extortion. Yet, Lobengula's actions seemed to be against his own will, a raid against Gomara incited by the expectations of his court. This Zulu king would seem weak if he didn't act, so he did act, but not without restraint, ordering his men this: "If you shed one drop of the white man's blood on this raid into Mashona land, I will have every one of you killed when you return." Well, the raid sparked off what was an inevitable war. 2 months later, 700 fighting men from the company came with 5 Maxim guns. The Matabele and the British came to clash.
They gave their battle cry on the first day of November of 1893. We fought the Matabele at the Battle of Bembezi. The wild Ngubo with the fierce Mbisu on their right came charging from the northern bush. They were a fearful sight, and near 6,000 warriors, we stopped them on the run. The bravest of the brave could never match the Maxim gun.
The First Matabele War came to an end at Bembezi, and the territory that would come to be known as Rhodesia was acquired by the British South African Company. The conflict proved the effectiveness of the Maxim gun. I mean, at one point, just 4 guns and 50 men held off 5,000 of the Matabele Zulus. At another point, the Matabele actually did see triumph. After losing 500 warriors, they had managed to obliterate their enemy, a 34-man patrol that had got caught north of the Shangani River. John Edmonds sings about this patrol, a sort of South African and Rhodesian Alamo.
But Wilson and his troopers were surrounded in the night. Said Wilson to the volunteers, "We will stand and fight." At the Wild Shangani and down the other side. At the Wild Shangani where Alan Wilson died. With horses in a circle, they sang "God Save the Queen," and 34 young troopers would never more be seen. They killed 10 times their number, they're only on a roll. So take your hat off slowly to the Shangani Patrol.
Despite the deadly efficiency of the company, 3 years later the natives would revolt against their new rulers, convinced by superstitions spun by their spiritual leader that the settlers were responsible for plagues and famine. Blaming a cattle disease on their colonial authorities, the Matabele and Shona rose up in arms against the company. There was much fighting, and as one would expect, the company prevailed again. 400 or so British troops were dead by the end of this war, yet an astounding 50,000 of the Matabele and Shona made up the native casualties by this conflict's conclusion. One could write off these astounding victories of the company as a direct result of advancement in firearms, such as the brilliant and effective Maxim gun, which made battlefields into slaughterhouses. However, as we will see with the Rhodesian Bush War, even when the settlers were under extreme sanctions, outnumbered, and fighting a force just as armed as they were, discipline and professionalism provided them with the upper hand. The Maxim guns at Bembezi were as effective as the RLI and their encounters with the communist revolutionaries of ZANU and ZAPU. In 1923, the territory was brought into the United Kingdom. The company was no more, and self-governance was established in Rhodesia, the landlocked nation's name from the company's Cecil Rhodes. All was well for Rhodesia, which would see a safer and more luxurious lifestyle for its people than other colonial territories in Africa. The fertile lands would become a breadbasket of Africa, and the white settlers would begin to see the land as their homeland with each generation. Yet things changed after the Second World War. African nationalism was spreading throughout the continent, and many natives were calling for independence. The Soviet Union and China soon saw an opportunity to strike at the West, which controlled the entirety of Africa at this point. The hand of communism began stirring up this trouble throughout Africa, seeing independence movements as a way to further their cause of global revolution. Such troubles came to Rhodesia, even though a sizable amount of Africans were fine with their way of life, not seeing an issue with the order of things, or, as it is known, minority rule. These Africans would make up the bulk of the soon-to-be-formed Rhodesian African Rifles, serving the government of Ian Smith. Now, with the African nationalism movement, the British had taken up a position to appease such calls for independence. They wouldn't allow any of their territories to secede without allowing quote-unquote majority rule. This concept was simple and at first glance seems reasonable. The African people were to make up the majority of the government in the colonial territories to better represent the populations of these lands. This is a tenet of democracy. The government is to represent the people. Yet there is an obvious issue with this stance. The Africans under white rule throughout Africa were never prepared to take up this rule, and it was no fault of their own. There had been no attempt to raise up a generation of African leaders to take the reins of Africa from the Western colonizers. Such notions were dismissed as an unnecessary postponement of something seen as both necessary and just. With the support of the international community, the British must have been very happy. They were able to wipe their hands clean and retreat from a continent becoming a heavier burden with each day, leaving behind their problems to an inexperienced leadership propped up merely because they were African. At the same time, they'd still have their hands all over these independent states, just without the obligation to further develop them or establish any sort of stability. What a great stance for the British, but what a bitter stance for the Rhodesians and other white colonial settlers of African territories who were very involved in developing these nations and seeking out their prosperity.
They forget about the evil that lies rampant and raging in their homes. They forget about the ghettos and the busing and the Indian people that they now disown. Is it any wonder that we gang on the sanctimonious trash they try to feed us through the barrel of a gun?
Fed up with this British stance and sure of their right to self-governance, on the 11th of November 1965, Ian Smith made the hardest decision of his life. The Rhodesians under him issued a unilateral declaration of independence. No state would ever officially recognize Rhodesia, yet it found cautious allies in Portugal and South Africa. Meanwhile, the United Nations set out to beat down the Rhodesians with sanctions, trying to cut off their supply to arms. As the West cut off Rhodesia, the East took their opportunity, training and arming the radical African communists and revolutionaries. Just about the entire world was against them.
What a time it was, with so few friends to turn to. What a time it was, when all we did seemed wrong. We'd broken all our bonds and the battle plan was drawn. What a time it was. 1965, the year of UDI. Who'd have thought the country would survive or stay alive? The UN made us outcasts, and the British said we couldn't last, that we would fall when the oil did not arrive. Now I don't say we were right, and I don't say we were wrong. I'm just trying to tell it like it was in simple song. You see, when people love their homeland, they regard it as their own land, and they fight whether they're right or they are wrong. What a time it was, with all the world against us. What a time it was, not all we did was wrong. We'd broken all our bonds, but life kept going on. What a time it was.
With a new flag, the Rhodesians set out to fight two wars, one against sanctions and the others against an army of guerrillas and terrorists. Violence had begun a year earlier with the murder of a white foreman, part of a close-knit community. The murder struck home. Ian Smith moved to detain the ZANU and ZAPU leadership responsible. The two organizations saw this as a declaration of war, and attacks began. The white settlers, who had established permanent towns and farms, were the targets of revolutionary violence. Under embargoes and sanctions, the Rhodesians began to mobilize their forces, drawing up men to defend their homeland from attackers stationed just across the borders. South Africa helped supply the Rhodesians, though these dealings were discreet, even when the BSAP, the British South African Police, came over to fight alongside the Rhodesians. The Portuguese also aided the Rhodesians from their territory of Mozambique, which was also a target of communist African nationalist revolution. Africans stirred up by Russian and Chinese Marxists to revolt against their colonizers. While the West was to paint the Rhodesian struggle as one of whites against blacks, the Rhodesians under Ian Smith saw it different. With entire units made of black Africans, the Rhodesians saw their enemy as a foreign threat, radicals who were supplied by a faraway enemy. They weren't fighting their own people per se, they weren't armed against an internal threat, a cause of independence for example, but instead were fighting the agents of international communism, a clearly external threat. Now, the Rhodesians mainly fought a war of counterinsurgency. Nick Downey explains in an article of his written in 1978 that the conflict on paper should have been over within only a few years. To police the 2,000 miles of border and inhibit the activities of 12,500 guerrillas dispersed in small groups over an area of 150,000 square miles, the Rhodesians can only field some 25,000 men at a time. Of these, a mere 5,000 are full-time soldiers. By all the normal military equations, this increasingly bloody little war should have been decided several years ago. That it continues is remarkable, and it is worth examining the tactics and organization of the opposing forces. Economic sanctions have deprived the Rhodesians of most of the paraphernalia associated with modern counterinsurgency campaigns. They are desperately short of helicopters. Many of their aircraft are old and outdated, and much of their equipment is locally made. The vast African heartland is patrolled almost entirely by men on foot, and the war has become very much a matter of individual military skill, fought at close range under the leadership of platoon and section commanders. Lack of gadgetry has forced the Rhodesians to concentrate on basic infantry expertise and to rely heavily on improvisation and initiative. On the whole, this has worked to their advantage. The guerrilla campaigns of ZANU and ZAPU were incredibly incompetent. Downey explains, there are a number of reasons for Mugabe and Nkomo's military failure. The first is training. It is a curious fact that guerrilla training all over the world generally bears no relation to the realities of combat. Recruits learn little more than basic weapon handling and a variety of minor tactics, which involve a lot of shouting and gallant of suicidal onslaughts. Such demonstrations may impress the casual spectator, but to a military observer, they are acutely embarrassing. However, in most guerrilla armies, the recruit is then fed into a battle-hardened unit, where he rapidly picks up the necessary skills under the wing of experienced comrades. In Rhodesia, there are few, if any, such guerrilla bands, and most recruits are shoveled across the border and left to fend for themselves. It is hardly surprising that, when they do eventually meet the security forces, they tend to come unstuck. The second failure is that of the leadership in the field. It is vital to any guerrilla force that the experienced commanders live and work in the operational zone. In Rhodesia, it is unusual to find any guerrilla officers above the rank of a platoon commander. There is the occasional equivalent of a company commander, but above that, nothing. Considering the thousands of men now infiltrated into the country, this dearth of military leaders is quite disgraceful and contradicts the most basic rules of guerrilla warfare. Discipline and morale are possibly even more vital to partisan activities than they are to regular forces, and the knowledge that one's superiors are living it up in a safe base is highly destructive. Downey describes the two sides, that being the Rhodesians and the revolutionaries, saying, on the one hand, we're a group of highly skilled professionals, and on the other, an enemy whose lack of ability almost defies description. He later goes on to illustrate just how effective the Rhodesian military was when it came to their kill ratio, a metric used so often in the Vietnam War. The overall kill ratio of the security forces was for a long time 9-1, but with the recent influence of guerrillas in larger units, that figure has risen to 15-1. Even so, this statistic is slightly misleading, as it includes Rhodesian casualties caused by landmines, road ambushes amongst troops serving in low-grade defense units, soldiers murdered while on leave, and accidental deaths on duty. It also takes no account of the enormous damage done to guerrillas during raids into Mozambique and Zambia. During fire force operations inside Rhodesia, the kill ratio is of the order of 60-1. But in one 3-month period, the company whose activities are described above accounted for over 100 of the enemy. They lost only one man in the process. In cross-border attacks, where the guerrillas are concentrated in large numbers and are largely untrained, the result can be little short of wholesale slaughter. To further illustrate the enemy's incompetence, the insurgents were unable to even see success against most farmers. Though there were numerous attacks on the country's agricultural sector, in many cases, these raiding groups of 30 or 40 fighting men were driven off by just one family. That's right, a man, his wife, and his kids defending the opposite of a fortress were often able to send a sizable amount of these guerrillas fleeing. Sometimes, all it took was the wife, even. This shows us that while the professionalism of the Rhodesian army seems to account for its overall effectiveness in the field, the devastating losses of the ZANU and ZAPU forces fall almost entirely on the shoulders of their leadership. They had barely any training and lacked discipline in their ranks. Without proper command, it is no wonder that the hardened fire teams of the Rhodesian security forces were able to turn battles into slaughters. What the British had done at Bembezi with the Maxim gun was replicated by the Rhodesians through discipline and command against an enemy lacking experience or solid organization. Operation Dingo might be a perfect example of just how good the Rhodesians were as a fighting force compared to the utter incompetence of Mugabe's so-called freedom fighters. From the 23rd of November to the 25th of November 1977, the RLI, Rhodesian Light Infantry, and the SAS set out to strike Chimoio and Tembu, guerrilla bases established in Mozambique. The book series Africa at War gives us this summary of the raid. On the 23rd of November 1977, the Rhodesian Air Force and 184 SAS and RLI paratroopers attacked 10,000 Zanla cadres based at New Farm, Chimoio, 90 kilometers inside Mozambique. 2 days later, the same force attacked 4,000 guerrillas at Tembu, another Zanla base, over 200 kilometers inside Mozambique, north of Titi on the Zambezi River. Estimates of Zanla losses vary widely. However, a figure exceeding 6,000 casualties is realistic. The Rhodesians suffered 2 dead, 8 wounded, and lost 1 aircraft. To put it into perspective, the kill-death ratio for Operation Dingo is 3,000 to 1. It's hard to call the encounter a battle. The fighting quickly turned into a triumphant slaughter. How was this pulled off? First, Chimoio was hit by an airstrike 10 minutes after an airliner flew over the camp. The guerrillas thought it was a false alarm due to this airliner, so they had no chance to seek cover when the 4 Canberra bombers dropped their anti-personnel cluster bombs. Then, attack helicopters came, gunships. These killed most of the insurgents while the soldiers dropped in by parachute. The RLI and the SAS, deployed on 3 sides of their objective, moved in using sweep line tactics. They killed just as many as the gunships, catching the fleeing guerrillas off guard with their small arms fire. One is reminded of more ancient battles from this whole description, a larger force broken by a morale-crushing pinpoint strike, with the resulting rout being put down through pursuit, those trying to flee the battlefield cut down in their attempt to escape. By the end of the day, only 1 SAS soldier had been killed, and a pilot had been lost when he tried to crash land his jet. With only a handful of injuries to deal with, the raid at Chimoio would go down in history as a massacre. Perhaps one of those rare massacres when the victims were armed and dangerous at the moment that they were slaughtered. If the ZANU and ZAPU leadership had managed to pull together an effective fighting force, it's certain that Chimoio wouldn't have been such a slaughterhouse. Instead, their soldiers died despite being able to resist. One can imagine the embarrassment of such a defeat. There were many volunteers in the Rhodesian security forces, foreigners who came to fight under Ian Smith, taking up the same conditions and pays as the natives who made up the bulk of the army. Numerous Americans, for example, with their experience in the Vietnam War, came eagerly to fight for Rhodesia. Anti-communists, they made up the Crippled Eagles, a title that came after the war, when they got to see America, the supposedly free, prop up the dictator Mugabe. It's no surprise they got themselves a name after the war, as volunteers were integrated into the Rhodesian security forces. The only unit entirely made up of foreign volunteers had been a complete failure. Made up of Frenchmen, the unit was disbanded after a series of friendly fire accidents and crimes against civilians in the field. The unit's numbers had dwindled over time as well, as the men expected more pay than those they fought side by side with. They just weren't compatible with the likes of the RLI. The war would drag on for nearly 15 years, but the guerrillas would never see a military victory. The Rhodesians, despite strained by sanctions and having much less men at their disposal, were able to keep their nation stable. Despite farms being a prime target for insurgent activity, Rhodesia was self-sufficient and mainly exported food. Long-range patrols made up most of its military might, proving that even without a supply of helicopters and tanks, the Rhodesians could keep their land mostly secure. So the question becomes, why did Rhodesia fall in the first place? Well, South Africa gave in to international pressure surrounding the Bush War, and Mozambique fell to a similar insurgency of communist African nationalists. And with these monumental changes, Rhodesia had no more allies. It was them against the world truly now, as their former friends were either overthrown or turned against them. That Henry Kissinger used this to bring Ian Smith to the table, and an unfortunate compromise was made. Majority rule would be established in 2 years. For only 2 years, to raise up African leaders to take the reins of Rhodesia from Ian Smith and the Rhodesian Front, they tried their best, and in 1978, majority rule was established. However, ZANU and ZAPU had been banned from participating in the election. The international community seethed with anger over this, it seems. Yet one must ask themselves, would we allow a terrorist organization from participating in our elections? ZANU and ZAPU were terrorist organizations. Their warfare was one of ambush and fear, striking at farms they often failed to take. Though an African majority government was established in the new Zimbabwe-Rhodesia, the international community refused to recognize it. Fighting continued, and as the whites began to pack their bags and leave their short-lived homeland, an election was held including ZANU and ZAPU. Robert Mugabe was elected, and finally the international community was satisfied. America was pleased, as Mugabe seemed to be on their side in the Cold War, despite having had his army supplied and trained by both Soviet and Chinese communists. Like many African dictators, he'd play the West and East for his own personal gain, while his own nation would be left to fall into ruin. In the end, Rhodesia was replaced by Zimbabwe, a new nation with a new flag and a new regime. Robert Mugabe took the throne of the breadbasket of Africa, and he led it straight to ruin. A fertile land known for its exports became dependent on imports. Casting out white farmers, Mugabe allowed radicals to prowl the countryside and claim land as their own. They set forth and murdered the European settlers, taking over their farms as their own. The Rhodesians rightfully fled, and Zimbabwe was left with the leadership of Mugabe, and farmland it didn't understand how to use. The land wasn't even under majority rule, instead subject to a dictatorship. The land itself perhaps called for vengeance, famine after famine, subjecting the people of Zimbabwe to starvation. It got to the point where Mugabe himself called for white farmers to return. When this didn't work, he went to the United Nations, that criminal organization so responsible for this tragedy.
Oh, the green and white don't fly no more in Salisbury, and the PM doesn't drive a modest car, and they've changed the name, now it's called Harare, and the strangers drinking in the Flagstaff bar, and the trash is piling up on all the pavements, and you can't get milk and sugar, tea or bread. The country's broke and hospitals are crowded, so if you get sick you'll have to share a bed. Zimbabwe rulers, you were a wonder of the world, and they came from far to gaze upon your stones. Zimbabwe rulers, oh how the tide has turned, your heart is dead and all that's left are bones. The Troopy statue's gone away from Cranbourne, and the RLI aren't based there anymore, and the Kooks have made a compound out of Brady, and a beer hall in the quartermaster's store, and someone blew the ammo at Nkomo, and Joshua and the boys have all been framed. Zapu wanna have a go with ZANU, and I think that Buzarewa will be blamed. Zimbabwe rulers, You were a wonder of the world, and they came from far to gaze upon your stones. Zimbabwe ruins, oh how the tide has turned. Your heart is dead and all that's left are bones. Your heart is dead and all that's left are bones.